I really loved Hot Springs Island, but I also think the content was not the right fit for my players. So between that and then starting to look into kind of like the old school revival or the OSR scene, what was really kind of going down into kind of the spirit of not writing plots, but writing kind of like settings or scenarios. So that's where Neverland came in.
Hi, welcome to the Dieku podcast. I'm here with Andrew Kolb, and Andrew is the designer, artist, and everything else that you can think of for the amazing game, Neverland. So Andrew, welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I didn't realize you had a physical copy of the book, so that's great too. You really get to enjoy the kind of like foil, the gold foil on it on the cover.
It is, you can see the way the light catches it. It is a beautiful book. Highly recommend it, and I'll put links to where you can get it on Amazon, and you can also get it through DriveThruRPG in PDF format. So we'll be reviewing that in a little bit. But so the book Neverland by Andrews McNeil Publishing, and it came out in late 2020.
Yeah. Yep. I think was it October? Yeah, I think early October.
And then from there, you went on to receive 2 Ennie nominations. And I don't, it's very hard to find out if you won, but my vote was for you. But
oh, thank you. No, I did not win, but I think the nice thing about the Ennies is I think the nomination is really kind of the big thing to celebrate. Not that a win isn't great too, but I think just kind of like being recognized for the artwork, because I think the nominees were for the cover and then the interior art. So even just kind of as my first book to be nominated was humbling, to say the least.
And even though it was your first actual RPG book, you actually have a broad experience with design and layout and graphic design in general. And one of the things I wanted to start with is just your website, which showcases just a ton of the work that you do. And so you've got Neverland in the corner, and you can see, I think, some of your books, Edmund on Travels and Less Than Ronnie Step Out, are among your more prominent ones. But you've got a mid-century modern vibe to a lot of your artwork, and it really speaks to me, my vintage, at least as a kid. I grew up kind of reading these books that were hand-me-downs from my older sisters and stuff like that. So how did you get that style?
Well, I went to school for after high school I went to school for graphic design, because that was kind of like what I knew as far as if you want to kind of like have a career in art, that's kind of like a good stable approach. So after a number of years of both kind of like school and working in design agencies, I transitioned into illustration. But I think the training in design and kind of like that study of kind of like typography and layout, I think really kind of, I don't know, shifted my focus towards kind of like clean design and kind of, I think what the aesthetic of like mid-century design and illustration really kind of was built upon. So yeah, even like this kind of book that we're looking at now, which was based off of the second of the Marvel Spider-Man movies, was like heavily influenced by the kind of like M. Sasek, like This Is series, because there's like a lot of travel, and because my illustration tends to lean towards mid-century, so it's kind of like a nice marriage of that. But as far as how I kind of like develop my style, I think it's just over years of drawing and kind of, I mean, like same as you, like I think reading the kind of like little golden books from the kind of like 60s and 70s, and watching kind of the old Hanna-Barbera cartoons and Looney Tunes growing up, just kind of like left an indelible impression on me. So that's what I carry over into my work today. Yeah, and I've gotten to work with a lot of really cool people too. Like I think what's on the screen now is an early ages board game based off of the It's a Small World ride at Disney. So getting to kind of like interpret all the different parts of the ride into these kind of like little segments. Yeah, lots of fun.
And when you started in just doing graphic design, like did you graduate from a program and then started into the agency kind of work?
Yeah, so I went through, I'm from Kitchener, Ontario in Canada. So there's a kind of a local college that has a really great design program that I went through. And then they had a bridge program in Australia, and we're connected with Griffith University in Australia. So I ended up doing an extra year abroad, and then came back and started working in design agencies, and then also teaching a bit. And that was for maybe 8 or 9 years. And at the same time, I'm also doing illustration work, like in the agencies and also for myself. But it wasn't until kind of like maybe 7 or 5 or 6 years into my career as a designer that I really recognized that what I loved most about the kind of like design projects that I was working on was when I got to illustrate. So that was where I started to kind of like try to spin as many plates as possible, keep like design going, keep my kind of like part-time teaching going, and then also trying to branch into illustration. So doing personal projects and kind of like doing concept work, like as much of my site is kind of like client work, there's also still lots of personal projects on there, only because one, it's like a nice chance to kind of explore and push myself, but two, because it's a nice way to kind of like show this sort of work I would like to do. So if I mean, like what we're looking at now, really character driven, which was kind of like an October drawing challenge, because I always like kind of character based projects. So, you know, when you're working on a personal project, if you want to do more maps or if you want to do more character stuff, then you have to kind of like do that yourself to be able to show people this is what I would do if I was given the chance. So yeah, that's kind of like how I've transitioned into illustration and how I continue to kind of like find work today.
And how has your methodology evolved over time? Because I assume you probably started off on pencil and paper, and you might still use that considerably, but are you moving more and more into digital space now that the tools have become better?
Yeah, I mean, I think almost all of my sketch work is still done by hand. I think because as many years as I've now been illustrating, I think because I was drawing for as long as I could hold a pencil, I still have far more comfort with pencil and paper. So most of my concept stuff is still done by hand. And I know we haven't really kind of gone into the RPG stuff yet, but even my like book layouts or when I'm like trying to figure out tables for kind of like an individual spread, I will still do that by hand because it's just quicker and I can like get an idea out and then move on to the next one just as quickly without any kind of slowdown. Like I think I can draw almost as quickly as I can think when I'm drawing by hand. But once the concept stuff is done, then it's all digital, and it has been for a number of years. When I was in school, I really started with kind of like vector because I think that's what I assumed you were supposed to use. So I was using Adobe Illustrator. But when I really transitioned into illustration more full time, then I got an Intuos, like a Wacom Intuos tablet, which was kind of like not like an iPad where you're like looking at the screen where you're drawing. It was like you draw here, but then it shows up there, and it was great, and it really kind of like unlocked the like kind of texture and the kind of like natural flow that I was comfortable with with pencil and paper, but in a digital space. And then once I really saved up and had enough money to buy a Cintiq, which is kind of like the screen-based tablets, then it kind of like it was just exponential as far as kind of like growth. Because it was just like drawing on a sketchbook, but now I could use the kind of like Photoshop and these brushes that I had, and it just yeah, it really became, here's what I have in my mind now in a digital space. So yeah.
Well, I mean, it's amazing work. And when I reached out to you, I threw up the idea, like I collect this stuff, and you mentioned the M. Sasek books, which I'm a huge fan of. I have a bunch of them myself, and he's an incredible designer. And what was the book that you mentioned, Mr. Product? Was that the...
Yeah, I don't know if it's right. Yeah, it's called Meet Mr. Product, which is like a similar kind of like catalog of yeah, exactly, of like essentially advertising characters from kind of like the mid-century, because it was just like so influential. Like I'm obviously a product of Saturday morning cartoons, which is as much the cartoons as it was the advertisements of cereals and games and toys and the like. So all of those kind of bright colors and flashy graphics have just like seeped into my brain, and it now has been become what I now put out into the world as well. So yeah.
so you've got this really amazing career. You're doing all sorts of cool stuff. And then when did you discover role-playing games? And then a second part of the question is the evolution of like, okay, I'm playing a role-playing game, and then I want to make a role-playing game.
Okay, yeah. So it was around the introduction of, like, I didn't play RPGs growing up. Like, I think my gaming experience as a kid was like video games and board games, I suppose. But I didn't really even know about D&D until maybe kind of starting to get into high school. But even then, still wasn't really kind of like in the scene. It wasn't until fifth edition when a friend of mine from high school, his cousin and his roommate wanted to play, and they kind of like had a small group, but they needed another. So I said, yeah, of course. And obviously he knew that I played video games, so there's probably going to be like some overlap in interest. So we went out, and I hadn't made a character. I didn't know anything about what I was getting into, except for kind of like the vague concepts of tabletop role playing. But from that first night, I was hooked. Like he ran this cousin ran the kind of like Lost Mines of Fandelver. So just kind of like the out of the box fifth edition adventure, and was hooked. Like we like finished that starter adventure. My friend then took over as DM and then ran a years long campaign. I was then next in line to run the adventure, but the kind of like group disbanded, as kind of happens over the years. But because I still loved it, because I really wanted to keep that kind of as part of my life, that was where I got into running games for friends and family who had never played before. So I was really pretty quick. Well, actually, no, I was like playing for a couple of years, but pretty quickly transitioned from player to DM, and really then dug into understanding like kind of how to run a role-playing game, and then also researching how to kind of best get new players into it. Because I was really just thrown into the deep end, which was fine, because I also had like a history of like of video games. So I kind of like had the vague ideas of like, I don't know, RPGs in general. But when I'm running it for kind of like friends who aren't really in that scene, or family who are doing this to kind of humor me, that was where I wanted to find adventures or find like characters that really helped, or like kind of like were easy to kind of like get into it without kind of like feeling like, oh, I don't know all the lore and I don't know all these rules. So that was where I started to kind of like write some of my own adventures, or work with existing adventures and really kind of like tweak them to not simplify, but to make it more palatable for a newcomer, or for at least like the players that I was playing with. And then I guess that over years of kind of like reworking and kind of like kit bashing other people's adventures, was like, I think I could write something, and had played or had read through Hot Springs Island, which is like a hex crawl, and it's not specifically for fifth edition, but it's kind of just like an open world setting that really clicked for me, as far as, oh, the reason why I haven't been kind of like working with these adventures is because it's like a single plot, and I have to remember all these things, and it's hard, for me at least. But with Hot Springs Island, really was like, oh, right, this is like a setting, and things are happening more like a chessboard as opposed to a video game with like scripted events. And you can respond as the DM to how the players play. So all these kind of like big bad evil people have plans, but if the characters don't do anything, then this plan happens, which then changes this, and so on. So it kind of like becomes a Rube Goldberg machine. And this is my long way around of getting to how I got into Neverland, which, like, I really loved Hot Springs Island, but I also think the content was not the right fit for my players. So between that and then starting to look into kind of like the old school revival or the OSR scene, what was really kind of going down into kind of the spirit of not writing plots, but writing kind of like settings or scenarios. So that's where Neverland came in, was kind of this merger of, oh, this is the sort of setting I want, as far as kind of like open world and not driven by a single plot. And then also a number of players who wanted to play and liked getting together and that kind of like adventure, but the tone of the other games that I was reading wasn't the right fit. So and as you can see through my art, I'm like pretty lighthearted and jovial and kind of like light bright colors. So I wanted something that wasn't like Candyland, but something that was at the start something a bit like lighter. So that's where, and I've always loved Neverland as a well, like the Peter Pan stories. So thought of that as an island, and thought of, I mean, like, pirates, mermaids. Like if you know the story of Peter Pan, then you kind of already know some of the big players. So for my like friends and family who wanted to play but maybe didn't know the lore of like Faerun or the kind of like like the Wizards of the Coast settings, did know what to expect from pirates and the Lost Boys and all these kind of like the different factions. So that's where it all came about. I don't know if that even answers your question. That's just kind of like my life story. But that was kind of the start of it. That's how I kind of got into RPGs.
And when you were exploring, like, okay, I'm going to actually design one myself, and you chose Neverland as the setting, did you start to do more research into it and start to like kind of spitball, like what would that look like as far as the characters, the cast, as you put them in the book? And then how did you the process of going, what goes in the book, what's the story, and like how long did you kind of ruminate over that?
Oh yeah, okay. So I think for writing, because I think the other thing to keep in mind is this was pitched and published like a traditional, like you would like a storybook, because I have like history in kind of like the publishing industry with picture books. Then essentially I went to my agent, because I have like a literary agent who like works like with me for like on my picture books. Went to her and said, this is my idea, and she's like, I don't know what this is, but and then we started talking about it, and she was really great and also very supportive, which I so appreciate, because I think it has really kind of like blossomed in the kind of like subsequent years since then. So I think, yeah, she's far more versed in D&D now than she ever was before. But that also changes the kind of like the timeline. So I guess leading up to the point where we were like pitching the book, which was like I had to have some layout done, I had to have the whole thing written, and I had to have some sample artwork. That lead up was probably a good year of me reading through the books again and making notes, and then coming up with random ideas of like things I wanted in the book, like enemies that learned over time or things like that, and then really kind of like bringing it all together. So it probably took about a year of like writing, and then as far as layout, because much like picture books, or like with any book pitch, you don't need to have the entire book done, or you really shouldn't, because then a publisher knows that you can that you're willing to change it, or you're willing to kind of like edit it. So with the pitch, I had like a single layout of like each hex, so a single spread, and then another spread of kind of like rules within the world, which had some artwork, and then a spread of like just random tables. And that was it. Like I had so maybe 3 or 4 drawings between the sample artwork. I did have the whole map sketched out, but that changed. And that process maybe took another month or 2. So probably about a year of writing, and then about a month or so of kind of like package prep, which I then, with my agent, pitched to publishers. And that's how we found Andrews McMeel. And that's where kind of like Neverland really took off. And then it was like so much work after that. As much as I do picture books and I know books, these RPG books, because I do them all myself, like the cartography, the writing, the layout, it takes so long, and I love them, but it's just such a longer process than let's say a picture book. So yeah, that's the general timeline.
And so now I'm wondering about your schedule, because obviously just from your website, you do a lot of output of other designs and illustrations. And where did you find the time to actually write the book? Like, was it evenings, weekends? Like how much of a time commitment was it?
Well, so the thing is like, so I'm like completely freelance as an illustrator. So basically what it would be is like, yes, evenings and weekends, but it'd also be, I don't know, if I have client work that takes 6 hours of the day, then, those extra kind of like 30 minutes here or an hour there, I would do a little bit more, or I would like write up another stat block for a monster. Like the nice thing about kind of once I had the kind of big picture stuff done, is it's all these little bits that really kind of like take a lot of time, but don't need a lot of kind of like momentum to get into it. Like I can really like take 15 minutes if I'm done a project early and I've got a half hour before lunch, I can take 15 minutes to write another stat block or write another character description or 2 or 3 and then take a break. So it really was just kind of like fitting it in, and just like any gaps in my schedule would be filled in with Neverland for months. And that was kind of how it went. And then if there was like a window of time where like a project ended at the end of the month and there was a week before the next project started, then that whole time was just me working on Neverland. In the same way, it was essentially how I approached my like personal work. Like, not that the personal work ever pushed client work out of the way, but it always just like it fit in. Like I always just like made it fit. Now once it got picked up, like once the publisher said, okay, here's our timeline, then it became like a formal project that like if a client came to me and said, can you work on something in this month, if I was dedicated to Neverland, like that took over, because now it was less a personal project and more a like I have a deadline, I have a budget, or like I'm getting paid for this, and that was the shift. But yeah, lots of evenings and weekends, lots of just kind of like making notes before I go to sleep of something like, oh, I wanted Hook to look like this, or this is how I want the illustration to do, and then just like a small doodle and then falling asleep. So it's just like it's constant for the months leading up to the book. It's just not all I think about, but pretty much all I think about.
In Andrews McMeel, they've gotten into tabletop role-playing games. Zweihander is the one that kind of jumps out as their big one. And you worked with Daniel King from the or sorry, not Daniel King, Daniel Fox from Zweihander. And how was that relationship, and what kind of team did you have at your disposal for developing the book?
They've been really great. Like I think working with them has been like a pretty smooth process. Like I think they have a great balance, or I think we found a good balance, or at least I'm happy with me coming to them when I have questions of like, is this balanced, or how would you approach this mechanic? And then we talk about it. But if I don't come to them with those questions, then they completely trust me that I'm like, they're not going over each stat block and going, this character is too powerful or not powerful enough. They really are looking at it as like a big picture stuff and going, okay, does this have enough story to balance out the monsters? But it's all very high level. It's not, they absolutely do not micromanage, which is like good for me. Like that's what I really appreciate, because then whenever we kind of get stuck on something or go, I think we need more maps to balance out the kind of like adventure. Then they're not saying do a map for this location. They're just saying, I think if we have a few more maps, then it will feel like it'll feel balanced. So yeah, very high level feedback, but can also really kind of get into the weeds with me when I have a specific question. So I think that's the general approach. And Daniel's brought a lot of kind of great insight from his own experience, both with like marketing a book and also just like kind of creating, like, I mean, the Zweihander books are insane. Like as much as I think it's a lot of work for what I do for my Neverland book, they're so much more robust. So he has so much experience that has really kind of like cascaded down into my work. So yeah, the relationship has been great. And I don't just say that because they may be listening. I promise I really am enjoying working with them.
And was there ever a thought of designing your own mechanics, or were you always like, no, I'm just going to make it a 5e product or compatible?
Yeah, I think what it is the book. The majority of the book kind of like could work with any system because it is mostly setting driven. Now the monsters or the kind of like the stat blocks for characters do lean more towards 5th edition, but I would say that I think like how I've pared down some of the stats and that make it a bit more streamlined. So not that that's my own mechanics, but I also really kind of like playing in the 5th edition system. So I'm happy to kind of like work towards that. As far as designing my own mechanics, there are like some small parts in the book. Like there's one for a chase mechanic that works really well, kind of like in person, that I like. And in Oz, I've introduced a new chase mechanic because the one in Neverland doesn't work as well online, I found, because it's more like rock, paper, scissors based. Which is great in person, but if there's a lag on the video stream, it just kind of breaks down. So I like designing small mechanics to kind of like supplement things that happen in your games. But as far as making a whole new system, I think just like that's not my interest. Like I really like kind of like the building worlds as opposed to the kind of like mechanical stuff.
Cool. And I'm going to dive right into to showcasing your great work here.
Oh, great.
So we've got a beautiful cover, and that was one of the Ennie nominations was best art for the cover. So congratulations on that. And
thanks.
And I know we'll cover it a little bit later. I know you had different options for the front cover and everything that you were considering. And throughout the whole iteration process, it maybe as you see things and kind of pop up, like the logo itself, you also cover a little bit in your design process, which we'll get into. But if anything pops out to you as I kind of come through here is interesting that you go, this is like a lesson that you can pass along to some of the designers. Like even the three column choices for throughout most of the book.
Yeah, I think I stick to a pretty strict grid, and this is also where my kind of like history and design comes in. Like I really kind of tried to streamline font choices or number of fonts and or typefaces and kind of like working with the columns, just because for me the book isn't about, like, I think there are some RPG books that the design of it is part of the appeal, like it's part of the fun of someone who's going to run the game looking through the book, which I mean it's not that isn't part of this, but I think what I want out of a book is clear communication and like ease of use. So I think one of my driving forces was really looking at, okay, what are the things that when I'm running my early games, what are the things that I need to know off the top of my head? And then I'd make notes of it. Or like, this is a good example, like the kind of a clock system. I added more information as I was playtesting because I recognized, oh, this is something that I need to know pretty much on the fly. And I don't have, like, I've written it down somewhere, but I don't have it on hand. So one good example is Neverland is on a pretty kind of like, not strict, but it runs on both a 24-hour cycle and a like 24-day cycle. So on that graph on the bottom right where you're seeing the moon phases, I also then added the kind of note about where the crocodile rests, because it changes throughout the month. And that was something that I didn't realize I needed to have until I started to play test and go, oh yes, my players are entering this hex. Sometimes the croc is here, sometimes it's not. Is it here? And then I would like go to my notes and find out, yes, it is. So then that changes the encounter. But knowing that took me time then meant I wanted that to be quicker for someone else running the game. Because if I, who have created this world, don't immediately know that information, then I can't expect someone who's never played it before to just have that off the top of their head. So that was where that information, or that kind of like clock graphic with kind of like where the crocodile moves throughout the day, things like that were just like necessary and things that I wanted to know quickly offhand. So that was where I decided, oh, this is a graphic that I need to make, so that way you can easily reference it. So yeah, and just kind of like scrolling back up, like obviously the 24 hours are pretty straightforward, but right in the middle where it shows where the crocodile is, whether or not it's patrolling or sunning or resting, I think was information that I as a GM or DM needed to know. So figured that I think is important for others to have as well.
And where did the idea for the chime that everybody can hear across the island come?
Oh, so part of actually, I don't know if the book is visible from here. So part of the research for this was really getting into kind of like the lore of fairies, because they kind of like play a, like, maybe not prominent, but because they're a big part of Neverland, I really wanted to expand upon that. And because I think the books get into Neverland, but they don't really kind of like flesh it out in a robust enough way to make it a full setting for an adventure. So that was where I started to kind of get into more lore about some of the other factions. So stars play a bigger role because of the kind of like second star to the right. The fairies play a bigger role, and the chime hours came out of that research for or about fairies, because that was kind of like one of the kind of like, not fables, yeah, just like maybe fairy tales. So all of these things kind of were built off of that. And actually, I will also mention, this is another good one right at the start. Something that I found in, I think everything that I did in Neverland was a response to reading other people's adventures and kind of like going, oh, what do I need? Or what is this missing? What I find for a lot of adventures is it'll just like kind of get right into lore or this kind of like mini novel, which is great, but it isn't, it like reading that novel, I don't know what information is important. Like when you're reading a book, by the time you get to the end of the book, you're like, oh, I now have this full story. But I think what I like is I would go through and highlight and then find out later, oh, this part isn't actually relevant to the adventure. It's like good backstory, but it's not relevant to the adventure. So what I started off with in this book is just like a brief overview of like, who are your main characters? What are their wants and needs? And kind of like, well, that's the title, what's going on? Because then I think it primes you for the rest of the book to go, right, I remember the spiders are important because of this and that. And this is how I can play them into this idea that I have with this detail. So I think that's maybe another thing as a takeaway. Obviously, this is all my personal bias, but I think really kind of giving a high level overview of the adventure right at the start really helps someone who is reading it to understand what they need to do. So yeah, that's kind of my tip.
And it is, I mean, it's like 2 pages and you kind of get the sense of the world going on, and you don't go into too much detail, a paragraph each essentially for each category of the what is happening in the world. And it's just a brief, like a teaser to get people excited by it. Like when I was reading through it, I went, oh, that's interesting. Like you talk about Peter Pan shadow that's roaming about, and the Elfame world and the mermaids, and like just it evokes so much within 2 pages, and you go, okay, I need to dig in.
Great. That's great. That's even better. That's ideal. I didn't even think of it as like a lead in, or as like an amuse bouche, but that's great.
And even all the travel shortcuts, and within 4 or 5 pages, people know what to expect of the world. So I thought that was great. And how did you decide that it was going to be like post most stories, as far as like the kids growing up? Like the movie Hook, Peter Pan is older and he comes back and he visits the world. But how did you decide that the world was going to be like set in a future state and with the kids, the darling kids?
I think because so I think Hook was a big influence. Not that I exactly wanted to be a recreation of Hook, but what I loved was,
for good reason.
Well, I think what it was I felt like the people playing the game have probably already aware of the like story of Peter Pan. So I didn't want there to be an element of like discovery, because I think that it was a big theme of this book and of the kind of the adventure. So I found by still having some secrets, or kind of like going forward in time, still allowed there to be something new for players to experience or to find out. And because I think the themes of the original book being around like time and aging, I think it was just like a natural fit. But yes, I tend to prefer stories that are set or playing in adventures that are set after the originals, or the original kind of like source, the source material.
Well, I mean, I thought the concept of Hook was really good. Maybe the execution was...
And actually, I haven't revisited it in my adulthood. I actually don't know if I would still. I mean, I still kind of like have a love for it, but I haven't gone back to it. It's encased in amber.
And so here's a design nerd question here. These illustrations that I'm looking at here, they're primarily black and white, but then you popped in green color, and that's just due to the printing process of having like a green plate?
No, it wasn't even that. It was because like it is still technically a four color print or process. But the inspiration being kind of like the mid-century picture books and kind of like that era of book design. I wanted to kind of like streamline the color palette so that way it was kind of like indicative or kind of like had that same like kind of same spirit. So that was where kind of each chapter really only uses one or two colors. So, and also helped differentiate the chapters too, like by having the world be in green, black and white, and then the cast be in red, black and white. You could quickly flip through and kind of like have a visual reminder. Like I also found, and you can kind of see on the PDF, but the tabs on the side are also easy or helpful for kind of like quickly flipping through to a chapter, like with the physical book. So also color coding it helps to simplify it when you're kind of like looking for something like, oh, I need to find a cast photo or a cast like stat block.
And some of the illustrations like are very much in your typical style, but then some of the other ones are like a little bit more fantastical, if I could say that, like more
Sure.
traditional D&D, what you might find. And how did you kind of balance it all out as far as that setting the overall tone of it?
Yeah, the cast photos are probably the ones that deviate the most from a style that I'm not comfortable with, but like most familiar with. And that was because I found my more stylized approach, I don't think served the characters as well. Like I wanted you to be able to, as a DM, hold up the book, show something to the players, and then they'd pretty quickly get a sense of what it is that they're looking at. Without thinking, oh, it's cute. Like I think the other thing is if you're playing D&D, you might be fighting this thing. So I still want there to be at least some element of danger or like feel like, oh, this thing might actually still be intimidating and could hurt us. And if I was illustrating too much like a children's book, I think some of that danger might get lost. So that is where the kind of cast illustrations went more towards a kind of realistic, a semi-realistic or like a stylized realism, as opposed to the first chapter and the kind of like last chapter with the tables. I have more stylized, more kind of like mid-century picture book illustrations.
And how fun was it to come up with the monsters?
Oh, one of my favorite parts. Like I think just kind of coming up with what is the thing that this, because I think the other thing about creature design is I wanted to have each creature have something special about them. So that way, when you're playing them, or if you're only going to run them once, this is the cool thing that they get to do, and is hopefully going to be memorable for the players playing against them. So that way, yeah, if they only see one of the green teeth once, then that's it. And they do their cool thing, or that's the kind of creepy thing that they do, and then you find another monster. So yeah, everyone I tried to have something different beyond just kind of like they attack with this sort of weapon and this is their armor. Some are simplified like that, but even the more complex or even the simpler ones, I still try to imbue with some sort of character, even in the stat block. Because I also think you can get a lot of character out of how they fight as well, or as much as kind of the outside of combat stuff. So I think if you can get some storytelling into their stat blocks, then that's, I think, a stronger monster design.
And I love the great white bird. And did you ever see what inspired that? Because like for me, I went, that's like, if it was not in a book, I don't know the Neverland story, if any of this ended up being monsters, but that one in itself made me go, wow, this is like, if Neverland was being written today, like it's such a perfect fit.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, the great white bird was, I think, inspired by, well, I forget the original name now, but like there's a never bird. And it's a bird that teaches Peter to fly. I'm wondering if I remember it correctly, but essentially that, I think, because I've also made, and there are going to be some mild spoilers for Neverland in here, because I made the crocodile this big, massive, almost like a Godzilla-sized creature. I wanted there to be other creatures on the island that could have at least kind of like compete with it or keep it in check, like that there'd be a relationship, not that the croc was the kind of like only thing. So having this kind of giant, almost prehistoric like bird just like felt right, and is also kind of like playing into what we were talking about with discovery. Like, you may know about the crocodile and the pirates and the mermaids, but then when this giant bird is swooping overhead or lands and just kind of like attacks a pirate ship, then that's something new. That, oh yeah, we were expecting pirates, we weren't expecting to be shooting cannons at cannonballs at this giant bird. That hopefully it's still memorable beyond just kind of like oh, I remember that. I want there to be some nostalgia, but I also want there to be some kind of like forward discovery as well.
And then we have on our screen Hook and the Pirates. And the evolution of Hook and the Pirates was, I thought, neat. I don't know if it's another spoiler, but by now, I think a lot of people have probably gone through your books. But I thought it was a really interesting concept, the way you took what could have been just like, okay, there's pirates, and kind of, once again, just twisted it just enough for it to be an exploration.
Yeah, and I'll happily reveal everything. So with the pirates, there are a couple of influences. So let's go back into a couple of things. One, falling stars are pretty prominent resources on the island because they're kind of like core arcane like magic. But then how is the island using this? And kind of like, where can I like slot it in interesting ways? So with the pirates, they are kind of like cursed undead. Think kind of like Pirates of the Caribbean, which was like a big influence on kind of like how I interpreted these pirates. So they're kind of like, they're skeletons by day and immobile, and then at night they come back to life. So not exactly like the original kind of like Pirates of the Caribbean curse, but I think because of that movie, I think kind of you can kind of see the kind of like parallels. But part of that decision was because I didn't want all of the enemies or all of the kind of factions on the island to simply be kind of like humans. Like, I wanted there to be some variety. The mermaids are obviously not human, but the Lost Boys are still going to be like children and humans. So with the pirates kind of having this undead component, then they could die and come back, or you could have like a cleric really kind of like hate the pirates, not because they're pirates, but because they're kind of like this kind of like atrocity. So again, you're expecting pirates, but you may not be expecting them to be kind of like skeletons by day and then these kind of like undead at night. So that was kind of the inspiration for that. Oh, and the thing with Hook is that he has like one of those kind of fallen stars that he uses to kind of like fight off the curse, or at least kind of minimize it, that he can still kind of like roam around during the day. Which then also means he wants more stars, which if your characters are looking for stars, then there's going to be conflict there. The whole goal was to have everything kind of like loosely tied together. And I know we're going to get to kind of like the sketchbook at the end, but there was like a map that I had drawn early on with all the different factions and kind of like essentially just like a spider web of or network of relationships of how are the pirates getting along with the mermaids, and why are they against the Lost Boys? Because I think those social interactions become more interesting to interact with as a player. Like, if you upset one group, does that upset another group, or does that make them happy? Like, how does that work? Kind of playing into the social component of it.
And as we've been scrolling through this, one of the things that I just absolutely love about your layout design is, even though you have the structure of the 3 columns, you play with it with the graphics and in being able to kind of break it up. Because I see so many books that are just 3 columns, 3 columns, 3 columns, and I just love the fact that you kind of can take the illustrations and break it up, which I suspect one of the reasons why you see the strict 3 column structure is the designer and the artist are not kind of working as the same person in your case.
Right. Yes, and that's exactly the kind of like the novelty or the kind of like benefit of doing everything is essentially my process for a page is if we want to pause on even going down to the next page with the show the pirates works too. It doesn't matter because it's all the same, but I will lay out the type first because that is kind of like the crucial component. Like I need to have this text, I need to have their stat blocks, but I don't always arrange it immediately. So once laying it out, then I'll export it. And sorry, I'm laying it out in InDesign. So I've written it up in Word, and then I format it and lay it out in InDesign, and then I'll export it as like a low res JPEG, which I then bring into into Photoshop, my like drawing software. so that way I can do rough sketches and get a sense of, okay, I have all of these kind of like individual illustrations that are just one column. I need something to break up the flow. Like I will go through the entire chapter or like all of the characters and just do very rough sketches. So that way I can then look at them and kind of like see the general rhythm from page to page. So that way it's not always tiny, tiny illustrations. And then the next page is tiny illustrations. And then the next page is tiny illustrations. If that's the case, then I try to maybe move a stat block over, or I try to combine illustrations. Like there are some pages where two characters are interacting with each other, and that's because I want there to be variety of size and shape of illustration as well. So I go through that whole process doing very loose illustrations, and then I will go back and do final artwork. And sometimes I will forget something, like forget to include something from the text, so I can go back and edit it. Or if I don't have enough room for the illustration, then I look at the text and go, can I edit this or shorten it to make room for the drawing, or vice versa? I only need the illustration to take up this space. Is there something more I can add to the text to fill up the rest of it? Like it's always kind of like a back and forth tug of war between the illustration and the text that I have the luxury of doing because I'm doing the whole thing. When someone is writing it and they're giving the layout off to an illustrator after, I can appreciate that it's very different for an illustrator to say, oh, this is my limited space, I'm just going to do this single column, or there's like this is the space for this drawing. But that's just a different dynamic. So yeah, very, very lucky to, as much as I talk about how much work it is, the end result is something that I'm really proud of.
And you know, there's just a handful, I would say, of people that kind of have your skill set, that not only do you write, you illustrate, and you do the layout. It's like in the triple threat in Hollywood.
In
right?
acting,
like, you
yeah.
know, I can act, I can sing, and I can dance, and you kind of do it all, and it really shows through in the design, as far as it seems so cohesive and put together that it's in other products, and no slight on other designers, but as you mentioned, like when you're writing something and then you just hand it off to the designer, or vice versa, where like you're trying to work your text around an art piece, you just don't have that flexibility.
Yeah, and maybe that's something that if I can offer a recommendation, or if there's the flexibility for a writer or for someone who's doing the layout to give the full page to the illustrator, and and obviously this depends on the kind of like the contract and the relationship, but I think the more information you can give to your collaborators, the better. Like if you're just telling your illustrator, I need an illustration that's this size by this size, then that's one thing. But if you're giving them the full page and saying, this is the illustration size we have, but maybe it could bleed over into this, or if you wanted to interact with the text in some way, then that's very different. Like I try to also work my illustrations to complement the page. Like it's not like everything is pointing in towards the gutter. Like I try to have the character illustrations point towards their own stat blocks or interact with their own stat blocks in a natural way. But I can do that because I can see the big picture. So to anybody who's writing or doing the layout, or even to the illustrators who are interacting or working on a book, if you can ask those questions and if you're comfortable or if the dynamic is right, why not? Why not say, can I see the whole page so I can like make sure that the illustration works with the full layout? Like I think it ends up producing better work. And I have that luxury because I'm doing it all. But I think even in collaborative spaces, you can still have that level of interaction as long as everyone's kind of working together.
And I just wanted to touch on, and I think in the OSR scene, you've gotten a lot of kudos because you made it a hex crawl essentially of the island.
Great.
And it's a lot of replayability because there's always something different that's happening within each hex all the time. So even though the island might be, you know, small, there's always something new between the different factions and different encounters. And you had mentioned like that was something that you wanted to do as like a sandbox setting, and then you go into so much detail. How much effort was it to make all these like unique tables for each hex? That's a lot of work.
It took a lot of time because well, and this is where also having that kind of like, and still going into sketches helps, because I had an illustration of the island and said, this is where the pirates spend their time, this is how they're expanding. Then I would essentially just kind of go through and say, okay, where are the pirates going to show up? And then plotting them in on those individual tables and just writing it by hand. Actually, no, at that point, I may have been doing it into like a Word doc, but essentially just kind of going through and saying, okay, where would the golden catfish appear? Okay, well, it's only going to appear on the coasts where there's water and where the rivers are. So then going through and finding all those hexes and then putting it in, and then just like filling in the gaps after. So like there are some areas of the island where you'll only some creatures will only appear in like one hex, just based on them only living in the swamp or only living in the mountains. But others are pretty common. And I think the time it took to kind of like balance that was long, but also felt very kind of like, I knew that it was a good investment, because at the end of the day, what I now have, and I mean, I'm slightly privileged in that I wrote the book, but like when I run this game, I can roll an encounter at the table and it feels natural. Like it doesn't feel like, oh, this is a random encounter. It feels like, oh, this was meant to happen here, or like I meant to see this creature here. And in play, what happens is, let's say they're on the rope bridges and then they're walking across the bridge and they see a water horse, and then the water horse doesn't interact with them, but they're like, they can see it down on the water, and then they move on and they live their lives. 3 or 4 sessions later, when a gnome tells them that they need the hair from a water horse to be able to kind of like concoct this potion, then the group goes, oh, where did we see them? And then go back and try to find it. And it feels natural and specific, and not like, oh, I was meant to see it there, or like it was specifically for the story. It was just a random encounter that like is natural to the island. And that is the result of me kind of like really spending a lot of time to go, oh, what makes sense here? And I like it's working so far. If anybody else is playing with it and finds otherwise, I would love feedback for future design. But yeah, that's the general approach.
And then you went so far as to actually make a Chartopia collection where you made each hex have its own little chart that you can just roll and see what's going to happen.
Yep. And that was something that I really loved about Hot Springs Island that they had done was, I didn't really even know about Chartopia until picking up that book, but it just makes it so much easier, especially with kind of playing online now. And I promise it's not always going to be no encounter, but yeah, playing online and being able to roll encounters at random makes it so much easier. Like I may have stuff plotted, but if they're going to go out into the jungle, what are they going to run into? And that gives you a lot of variety. And I think part of the loveliness of, or what's lovely about random tables is that it might create adventures or content or interactions that you may not have come up with. Like, even though I've come up with all of these random tables, in play, it becomes very different, where I was like, oh, I wasn't planning on the characters meeting Hook at this point, but he's here. Like I've rolled Hook, so I'm gonna have him introduce himself, and then thinking, what is he doing here, and what does he want? So it as much as I want it to be discovery for the players, I think having random tables also makes it a great element of discovery for the GM as well. Like for the DM to go like, oh, I had this planned, but because they've gone off in another direction, I have to randomly roll something now. And then you get to find out together what they're going to interact with. And maybe it's going to be a monster that's way too difficult for them. And then you as the DM have to decide, how do I telegraph this? How do I make sure that they know that they're in danger? And then kind of going from there.
And it probably makes you as a GM, it's a little bit more entertaining because you actually don't quite know what's going to happen either. And you're kind of on the fly and engaging in the fun.
Yeah, and I've run a couple different groups in Neverland. And what I love is, even if I tend to start them off with the same quest and on the same hex, every response has been different about how they go about finding fallen stars, about where they go first, whether or not they, like, some groups will really kind of like take to the pirates and kind of like try to kind of get on their side. Some will immediately kind of like respond negatively. Like it's always different. And that's, I think, part of the fun of running it too, is just seeing how different every interaction on the island is. Yeah, it's been eye-opening, even just like on a social level of what does this group do with the same pieces on the board compared to this group. So yeah, a lot of fun.
And Elfame, I thought that was brilliant to kind of bring that extra I guess, dimensional plane into it, and like it opens up the island into a bigger possibility.
Yeah, I really like the idea of, they could spend their entire time on Neverland and never find this or never engage with it, and that'd be totally fine. But knowing that there's kind of like, oh, this island is so big, and now there's like a whole other realm. Just I think discovery was kind of my main spirit or driving force of Neverland, and trying to add that as much as possible. Like the kind of old Legend of Zelda games were a big influence on this, because there were so many secrets that weren't telegraphed, like kind of like lighting this bush on fire with the candle, but it's like there's no sign that you're supposed to do that. Like I loved that, kind of having to talk to friends or reading through stuff. So that was kind of like the driving force. So finding a whole other realm, just like top tier discovery for me. So I wanted to share it as much as I could.
And if other game designers aren't jealous already by our conversation and all the great work that you've done, now we get into the maps and the cartography, which is, you're not only a triple threat, you're a quadruple threat, and how fun.
Very kind.
These
the maps are a stress for me. Sorry, continue.
Well, I was just gonna say, I thought they'd be fun, but that you're saying they're a stress.
Oh yeah, because I'm more comfortable with like character design and my like spatial awareness is not as strong as I think some game designers or game masters are. So maps are trickier for me. And like in actual play, when I'm at the table, my maps are always very basic, because I don't want to spend a lot of time building that part of it. Like I think the setting is more in the mind. So really like locking down a location in the illustration, it was stressful for me. I mean, like I'm happy with the results and I think it all works out. And I can draw a setting, but where I would say the cast illustrations, I would maybe get like a page done in a day. I would get like a single map done in the day. Like it was just like a much slower process because I'm thinking more about setting, or I have more to like, it's more of a challenge. But I mean, like it's all worth it in the end. Like I've used all these maps and players understand what's going on. So yeah, it's fun, but it's also a challenge.
Well, like I said, if it wasn't enough already, like just each one of these maps is so evocative. You could, as a person, I love seeing maps, and I can just spend hours and hours just like looking at the little minutia of detail. And
thank you.
It's a cohesive story, but so you've got like so many different elements to it. But I know we're getting low on time, but I just want to jump into your notes just so people can see. I thought it was really nice of you, at least from a design perspective, to be able to share your notes. And it's just going to take a second here to get to your sketchbook of how each one of these elements kind of comes to play. And so this is just little doodles, pencil on paper.
Yeah, these are all the scans or like the sketches that I would then scan in and blow up and kind of like do more details. And the sketchbook was actually kind of like a last minute addition. I had either misjudged the page count, or we had a few extra pages and we were trying to figure out, should we leave them blank for GM notes, or should we, what else can we add? And at that point I was rereading the kind of like Hellboy series, and I have the kind of like library editions, like the kind of thick kind of like fabric backed books, and in the back are rough sketches or kind of like notes very similar to this. Like this is absolutely copying that, because I loved seeing that in the comic. I was like, oh, I really like seeing how he goes from his like sketches to the final artwork, and going, oh, could we do this? And Andrews and Camille was really great about it. So I kind of like cobbled together all of my rough sketches. Some are digital, as you can see kind of up at the top there, but most tend to start off as very small pencil sketches. And whether it's here or in any of my other work, I tend to start small, because if it can communicate at like a thumbnail size, and this is my like design background, if your logo can communicate it down at an inch, then it's likely working. So if my thumbnails can work, at least for telling the basic story, then when I blow it up and do more detail, then I can get into, then I know it's hopefully a good foundation. But then I also go into kind of like, these are some of the early concepts for the title treatment, as we kind of like worked through figuring out what was the best kind of like mark to sell Neverland. And I think I talked about this in that kind of like little write up there, but the vines that are around the top of the Neverland text mark or word mark became the framing device for the rest of the book. So as much as some stuff had to get changed, it all still kind of like gets used. I try to use as much as possible, so that way it can like still feel cohesive. Yeah, and this is where you can see some of my kind of concepts for the cover design. Yeah, and this is absolutely the layout that I was talking about, where I basically laid out all the factions without really kind of focusing too much on the map, but having the relationships. So how does Pan feel about the fairies? How do the Lost Boys feel about the monsters or the pirates and so on? So that way I could really kind of build the island and going, oh, if the pirates often go here, then they're likely going to be showing up in that table. Yeah.
And this, you referred to this earlier, but your original sketch, and I think in your design notes, you mentioned that this has a little bit of the magic, and you might have even lost a little bit when it got a little bit more polished, but
yeah, I always find my sketches have just kind of like an energy that, and maybe it's going from traditional to digital, but yeah, there's something about going from sketch to final that always seems to just feel different. So that's why I also wanted to include these sketches too, to see kind of like the progress of, oh, I can see where this changes. And in my next book, because I did this in Neverland, Andrews and McNeil were great about Oz letting me do it again, or kind of like being on board with me doing it again. So I luckily kept more of my rough work for the sketchbook, and I go into more process in the back of the next book. So not to like be too much of a tease for Oz, but I think if you're looking for insight into kind of like more design, I want to keep that going because I think it's important to share that. So yeah.
And so as you mentioned, Oz is upcoming, and I noticed on Reddit that you've started to post some of the play testing that you've been doing for different things. So if people are interested in checking that out, the Adventures in Oz campaign diary is on Reddit, and Kolb is neat is the username. But just tell us a little bit about like what's the next steps, timelines, and what's it going to look like?
Yeah, so Oz is almost done. Like we're essentially kind of going into kind of like production now, which will be a number of months. So I think it's going to be it's going to be in the fall. So I think maybe close to the same time of year as when Neverland came out. So yeah, sometime in the kind of like, like end of the summer, start of school year. I guess for North America. But and then it'll be out. The timeline was pretty similar to Neverland in that like it took me probably about just shy of a year of like writing, and then obviously us pitching and making sure that it was the right fit for kind of like another RPG book, and then probably another like 6 months or so of polishing, and then another 6 months of kind of production. So the publishing industry, like traditional publishing, is like a big strong machine, but it's also pretty slow moving. Like it's not as immediate as putting something on Drive-Thru RPG and doing like print on demand, but that's just kind of like the nature of it. So yeah, Oz will be out in a while. It's pretty different from Neverland. Like it's still very much the same spirit of like random tables and more of a setting than a single plot. But where Neverland is a very wild, untamed space, or undeveloped space, Oz is a more like urban, not rural, an urban, like almost like a mega city.
Like a city
So
adventure.
that's, yeah. So I think that was also coming from me as a DM who's run so many adventures talking about jungles constantly, and swamps and beaches. It's really fun to now set up adventures that involve like robbing a mansion or kind of like exploring sewers and things like that. So while I don't know if you'd necessarily be blending the two books together, I think there's still a lot that you can kind of take from one and apply to the other. So that's Oz. Yeah. lots of winged monkeys and tin men and all the stuff you expect, but hopefully still lots of surprises too.
Those winged monkeys always terrified me as a kid when
Well,
they were ripping apart the thing. Is it going to be
yeah,
got that element of like a little bit scary for kids, just like
y-
Neverland has that piece if you need it?
yeah, I think, and I talk about it in the back of the book, or kind of like talk about as far as tone. If you need to, or if you're ever unsure about whether or not Oz can be a mature setting, then watch the sequel. Like, I think if you watch The Wizard of Oz and then The Return to Oz, the two are so different, but still somehow the same characters. So I think, and hopefully Neverland is the same, that if you want it to be a light, silly adventure, you can do it. And same with Oz. If you want the monkeys to be sillier, then you can. If you want them to be threatening, like feral creatures, then you can. As much as I've kind of given direction, I'm assuming a GM will take the book and make it their own. So yes, it can be mature. It can also still be a fun, family-friendly setting too. So it just depends on what you want to make it.
And because a lot of our audience is going to be like aspiring game designers, are there any kind of tips or advice that through this process and your ongoing process that you could pass along to them as far as lessons learned or advice?
I think my big thing, or my kind of big driving force, is really paying attention to what I need when I'm at the table and how I think. Like, what is it that when I'm reading other adventures, really kind of going, what is it that I like about it? And what is it that I would change? And thinking about why. So not just going, oh, I would put this at the start of the book. Going, the reason why I would put it at the start of the book is because I'm confused reading this now. Like, and I think that helps build kind of an understanding of what it is that you would then put into your own design. So that way, when you're teasing apart other people's work, and not to be critical, but it's really just to kind of like understand the mechanics of it, then you can go and say, okay, this is how I want to make this book and why. Because I think, especially making bigger projects can be daunting. So having a framework to go, and like my books are all broken up into chapters, which helps me keep it organized, but having a framework to go, these are the things I know I need in a book, because these are the things I need in adventures when I'm running an adventure. That's kind of helped me figure out, what to include, how to lay out the book, what the kind of like driving force of it is. So I would say that. And I would also say, if you're hitting a rut or if you're stuck on something, take a break and come back to it. But I would also say, think about what it is that you're stuck on. And I talk about this in the kind of like notes of Oz too, is sometimes I'll work on an illustration and it's just not coming together. And I'll try to figure out why, like maybe if I do this a bit differently. But sometimes it's just taking a step back and going, oh, the reason it's not working is because I'm really trying to make the illustration about this. But if I abandon that idea, or if I take a break from that idea and just start to explore, maybe it's not about, maybe I'm not going to draw a fountain, maybe I'm going to draw a skyscraper, and it's as simple as just shifting it to something else, then opens up the possibilities to go, oh yes, okay, I can do this, and then put a tiny fountain in it, and I'm still getting the part that I wanted, but in a different way. And I think that only comes from kind of like being reflective enough, or being reflective on like what you're running up against. Like when I get into trouble, or when I'm stuck on something, it's really kind of asking why. I think that's it. That's the takeaway, is ask, why am I frustrated about this block of text or this drawing or this layout? And hopefully you can answer that question and then kind of work towards that to improve it.
Well, that's great. And so besides Oz, where can people find you and keep track of all your projects?
Oh, so my website is Kolb is Neat, and that points to most of my social media. But I'm also, my handle Kolb is Neat is where you can find me on like Twitter, Instagram. Those are probably the two big ones. But that's where you can find me. And always happy to chat D&D or game design. So if anybody has any questions or just like wants to talk about games, I'm around. I'm available.
And if that wasn't enough, you also have enough side projects on you have a podcast with some mates of yours.
Oh yeah, I'm more of a guest speaker, or like a guest appearance, than a dedicated podcaster. But I do appear occasionally on the M of One podcast, and we were talking comics for a while. Now I run D&D with them, and occasionally we will kind of like do streams, or I will be like a feature. I'm more of like a guest appearance than a regular host, but I would definitely recommend their podcast too. And if you find or listen to any of the episodes that I'm on, let me know what you think.
Well, that's great. Well, I really appreciate your time and sharing your wisdom and knowledge and your experience on designing a game. And for my money, it's one of the best games I've seen. It's so comprehensive in its design and philosophy and look. I just think it's beautiful. So well done, amazing product, and I can't wait to see Oz.
Oh, thank you. Very kind. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.